Thanks again to the conference organizers. I'm glad to be here and see you all. My talk, as I half feared, half looked forward to when seeing the program, covers quite similar territory to the previous speakers, but I think they actually add to each other, because I'm looking at similar territory but at a different organizational level. So, like in a sense, I think both of the previous speakers, I'm also concerned with the intractable question of what makes a Muslim religious figure. I thought figure was a very useful term here for its very vagueness. Yeah? How does a particular individual come to be recognized in a particular institutional context as a legitimate Muslim religious figure, leader, sheikh, intermediary? And I look at this through the lens specifically of the role of Muslim religious persons and organizations in facilitating ART, so antiretroviral therapy, and HIV/AIDS work. And my information, unlike Muhammad's, is predominantly from the metropolitan urban setting from Dar es Salaam. It's based on work done intermittently, mostly between 2012 and 2015. I have sought to update it, but if somebody in the room knows something that I don't, I'll be glad to hear about it. And I certainly found myself with a very similar conceptual starting point to Muhammad's, in the sense that it is really very evident that so-called faith-based organizations, as a subgroup of so-called civil society organizations, which themselves are an extension of the concept of the non-governmental organization, have become part of a kind of neoliberal reorganization of the state, and especially the state's activities in aid and development work over the last 2 decades. So as you said, Muhammad, non-governmental organizations are in many ways governmental, and by extension this also applies to so-called CSOs and FBOs, and all of them are part of a process that has, by some observers such as Ruth Prince, I think quite perceptively described as one of responsibilization, whereby activities once claimed quite assertively by organizations that were explicitly part of the state are outsourced, if you will, to these much more vaguely defined intermediate organizations, religious and otherwise. And the rollout of antiretroviral therapy, of HIV/AIDS advice and service provision is a useful area in which to study this, partly because to a great degree it is still mediated through the PEPFAR fund, which was set up explicitly to include religious intermediaries because of the strong, born-again Christian influence at the time in US politics, which is where PEPFAR comes from. So, to start with a broad impression at the level of religious organizations in Tanzania, it is clear that since the early 2000s there have been efforts both on parts of the Tanzanian state through TAC-AIDS, the Tanzanian Commission on AIDS, and on part of a broad swath of religious organizations to make this cooperation in AIDS service provision work. So TAC-AIDS constantly talks, for instance, to the Christian Social Services Commission, but they've also been instrumental in setting up something called the Tanzania Muslim Welfare Network. overall, it is nevertheless quite evident that cooperation with Christian organizations is broader, is more extensive, appears to function better. Concomitant to what you said about the predominance of Christian intermediaries even in rural settings. Meanwhile, on the part of Muslim leaders, broadly defined, and organizations, there have clearly been efforts to interact with state representatives such as TAC aides, and to some extent to tap into the means provided by them. But my impression is that they have remained relatively limited. They have been successful to an extent, but they have not been as expansive as hoped. As far as I can see, there are to this day there are Muslim organizations, individuals that are involved in pointing people towards services, in facilitating access to them, in providing some advice, but there certainly aren't any Muslim-run facilities that offer the whole range of medical and psychosocial services around ART provision and HIV/AIDS. Now, it is fairly easy to find certain political reasons for why this is the case. As in the case of SUPKEM, as Hassan has described earlier, so for its Tanzanian counterpart BAKWATA, the Baraza Kuu ya Waislamu Tanzania, Muslim Central Council, there is a long-standing mistrust between sections of the Muslim community, between some Muslim congregations and this official representation, because of the way BAKWATA was very clearly created on state initiative, and also it replaced an organization that had been more independent. And this mistrust has been increasing in recent years with the general diversification of educational and ideological influences in the Tanzanian Muslim community. There was a lot of concern and shock about this in the early 2000s, but now I think people have by and large got used to the diversity, and there's more of a sense of live and let live. Nevertheless, the status of BAKWATA as the official representative of all Tanzanian Muslims is, in fact, very much in question. Another issue that is clearly at play here is the tone deafness of especially early AIDS information campaigns in Tanzania, which very much wholesale took on board the European precedent, whereby to talk about AIDS you have to break down all taboos about speaking about sex, which was really both about sex and to some extent about death, about how AIDS doesn't have a cure, you get it, it'll kill you, which flew in the face of very deep-seated sensibilities, not only among Muslims. Books could be written about how the use of this European let's break down all taboos template went wrong, and in fact for South Africa have been written. Now these are all factors that have been observed before in no end of context, the political mistrust between Muslims and the state especially. But I think what is also important to look at is what you could call the blindness of the aid sector towards the kinds of organizational structures that exist in the Muslim community. And just like you, I found myself drawn here to James Scott's notion of how state actors use certain concepts, certain notions that make some groups, some actors visible, and others invisible. And I think one implicit assumption that is made by donors, by people in the aid world, that is perhaps useful to try and bring into focus here, one category that is at play even while it isn't always stated, and that has very strong effects in terms of making Muslim actors legitimate or not, visible or not, is the dichotomy of the volunteer on one hand and the professional on the other. Implicitly, FBOs, CSOs, everything that is labeled civil society is supposed to be made up of people who already have an established working or professional identity and who do this, whatever they're doing, qua CSO members, in their spare time, in addition to that. Yeah? They're supposed to be, in that sense, volunteers, people who take on extra work out of social responsibility. And these FBO or CSO actors at the same time always imply the other, i.e. the actual professional, who remains in essence the expert, the aid expert. And to this day, I think if you look at how projects that have the ambition to engage with civil society are structured, you'll find that typically, very often, the divide between the expert on one hand and the volunteering personnel on the other is also that between the expatriate, who is the expert, and everybody else who is the local. Now, this distinction is always problematic. It is very clear, again, from work done by Ruth Prince, among others, that volunteers are people who are dreaming of becoming professionals. They're struggling for all their worth to get out of the role of volunteers. They're not typically people who already have an established place in life. They're trying to get somewhere by being volunteers in aid contexts. But when dealing with Muslim organizations and contexts, this distinction is, I think, particularly unhelpful, because if we look at the way Muslim religious as well as legal governmental activity has long been organized, you find, as we all know, that we don't get the specialized paid religious hierarchies that we find in Christian churches. And this is very much replicated in the Tanzanian context. I found it very interesting to look at the actual livelihoods of some of the people that I worked with who were very clearly sheikhs in everybody's understanding. My experience very much concurs with yours in the sense that, depending on context, a lot of people may be addressed as sheikh, but not all of them have a certain level of education, not all of them lead prayers. But even if we just focus on people who, the way it tended to go in my interviews was that there's a mosque, and then you ask, who is the sheikh for this mosque? Yeah? And then you tended to be introduced to individuals who fitted the classical definition, if you will, a narrow definition of a sheikh as somebody with education and who works predominantly in the governance of that institution relatively closely. But even these people often had businesses on the side, whether it was a corner shop or trading in mangrove poles, yeah? Fish in one case, they needed to live off something. Yeah? And this did not, in the eyes of their congregations, make them anything less of a religious expert. But obviously, it makes them something quite different from the sort of professional religious person that people from the aid establishment would expect to meet within Christian churches. So it seems to me that, to some extent, the absence of this distinction between the professional and the volunteer, the non-applicability of this distinction in the case of Islamic organizations, confounds donors and at the same time creates a situation where they're very liable to obscure certain actors within the Muslim community and be somewhat haphazard in terms of who they are able to see and who they endorse. Now, if we look at this from the other end, from the point of view of Muslim actors who are seeking to establish themselves, to make themselves visible, if you will, to the aid establishment, to become plausible as intermediaries, what we find is that these actors have to straddle very different worlds. Yeah? They have to talk donor speak, and they have to talk the language of their own religious constituencies, of their congregations. Which also means, and this I think is sometimes very evident, and I'd be curious to hear, Mohammed, how you saw that, they have to be able to practice very different performative styles. Yeah? With some people you could see this very clearly in their habitus and how they dressed, how they combined, say, a kanzu with a blazer. Yeah? That they were always facing two ways. Yeah? Talking about governance, organizational governance in English, and talking about maendeleo ya jamii, or even more clearly religious terms in Swahili. So I found myself here reminded of James Ferguson's work on the importance of performing rural and urban identities and going back and forth between them as a means of negotiating the particular kind of part rural, part urban modernity that he describes in a Zambian context. As I said, it seems that at the end of the day, the number of people who do this successfully, of intermediaries who do this successfully, remains relatively limited. And partly, surely, this is due to donor responses. But it is an interesting question also how the audiences take all of this on board, how people in Muslim congregations observe what they're seeing here. And this is actually the aspect of the situation that I find the most baffling, the hardest to trace, simply because there is, if I listen to my interviews with Muslim listeners to various kinds of sermon, there is truly a cacophony and a willingness to take very different kinds of language on board. So radical reformist rhetoric appears to coexist sometimes with striking ease with quite what in the Tanzanian context you could call traditional developmentalist rhetoric. Yeah? So people listen to radical reformist sheikhs, kwa maendeleo ya jamii. Yeah? Whereas on the other side, it seems to me, it is really the categories of people in the aid world, the categories of donors, that on the whole appear to remain strikingly inflexible. The kind of language that you have described, that's been around for the last 20 years, I think, and there really doesn't seem to be much evolution there. Ultimately, this, I think, leaves us with a situation that can be interpreted in very different ways, and I'm really not sure which is the right one. You said we're looking here at a form of subject formation in a biopolitical context. But you also mentioned, and this is something that I find very striking, that there are very clear resemblances between this kind of situation and what used to happen under indirect rule, in the sense that you have representatives of central authorities, be they aid or state-related, going out there looking for leaders, yeah? And being offered leaders, depending on a process that they don't really understand. Now, if you look at the literature, the historical literature on indirect rule, its focus really is very much on how this was a story of at least partly working misunderstandings, a story with lots of local agency in it, where in many ways those who were ostensibly in control, the representatives of the central state, were in a situation where they had to play along with the agency of people on the ground. So, is this about subject formation, or is this about intermediaries very skillfully straddling different performative styles and different institutional contexts? Is this then ultimately, if all of this can be understood as part of a process of the restructuring of governance in a neoliberal mold, I'm almost done anyway, if this is a process of responsibilization, is this nevertheless then a form of responsibilization that is to some extent self-limiting? Because the donors' lack of knowledge and lack of time and their need to spend funds actually creates certain necessities for them as well. It seems to me that it is very hard to see here where the main agency lies, and that who is in charge, perhaps, or who has the best opportunities to shape a situation very much depends on context and probably shifts very quickly. Okay, I'll leave it at this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.